Hello everyone and welcome back, and today I'll be continuing on reading Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Chapter 4, At Flourish and Blotts. Life at the Burrow was as different as possible from life in Privet Drive. The Dursleys liked everything neat and ordered. The Weasleys' house burst with the strange and unexpected. Harry got a shock the first time he looked in the mirror over the kitchen mantelpiece and it shouted, "Tuck your shirt in, Scuffy." The ghoul in the attic howled and dropped pipes whenever he felt things were getting too quiet, and small explosions from Fred and George's bedroom were considered perfectly normal. What Harry found most unusual about life at Ron's, however, wasn't the talking mirror or the clanking ghoul. It was the fact that everybody there seemed to like him. Miss Weasley fused over the state of his socks and tried to force him to eat 4 helpings at every meal. Mr. Weasley liked Harry to sit next to him at the dinner table so that he could bombard him with the questions about life with muggles, asking him to explain how things like plugs and postal service works. "Fascinating," he would say as Harry talked him through using a telephone. "Ingenious. Really, how many ways muggles have found of getting along without magic?" Harry heard from Hogwarts one Sunday morning, about a week after he had arrived at the Burrow. He and Ron went down to breakfast to find Mr. and Mrs. Weasley and Ginny already sitting at the kitchen table. The moment she saw Harry, Ginny accidentally knocked her porridge bowl to the floor with a loud clatter. Ginny seemed very prone to knocking things over whenever Harry entered the room. She dived under the table to retrieve the bowl and emerged with her face glowing like the setting sun, pretending he hadn't noticed this. Harry sat down and took the toast Miss Weasley offered him. "Letters from school," said Mr. Weasley, passing Harry and Ron identical envelopes of yellowish parchment. "Addressed in green ink. Dumbledore already knows you're here, Harry. Doesn't miss a trick, that man. You two've got them, too," he added as Fred and George ambled in, still in their pyjamas. For a few minutes there was silence as they all read their letters. Harry's told him to catch the Hogwarts Express as usual from King's Cross Station on September the 1st. There was also a list of the new books he'd need for the coming year. Second-year students will require The Standard Book of Spells, Grade 2 by Miranda Koshok, Break of a Bensby by Ginger Lockhart, Gating with Gulls by Glendory Lockhart, Holidays with Hags by Glendory Lockhart, Travels with Trolls by Glendory Lockhart, Villages with Vampires by Glendory Lockhart, Wanderings with Werewolves by Glendory Lockhart, Year with the Tetty by Glendory Lockhart. Fred, who had finished his own list, peered over at Harry's. "You've been told to get all Lockhart's books too," he said. "The new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher must be a fan, but it's a witch." At this point, Fred caught his mother's eyes and quickly abused himself with the marmalade. "That lot won't come cheap," said George, with a quick look at his parents. "Lockhart's books are really expensive." "Well, we'll manage," said Miss Weasley, but she looked worried. "I expect we'll be able to pick up a lot of Ginny's things second-hand." "Oh, are you studying at Hogwarts this year?" Harry asked Ginny. She nodded, blushing to the roots of her flaming hair, and put her elbow in the buttered dish. Fortunately, no one saw this except Harry, because just then Ron's elder brother Percy walked in. He was already dressed in Hogwarts prefect badged pinned to his knitted tank top. "Morning all," said Percy briskly. "Lovely day." He sat down in the only remaining chair, but leaped up again almost immediately, pulling from underneath him a molten grey feather duster. At least that was what Harry thought it was until he saw that it was breathing. "Errol," said Ron, taking the limp out from Percy and exaggerating a letter from under its wing. "Finally, he's got Hermione's answer. I wrote to her saying we were going to try and rescue you from the Dursleys." He carried Errol to a perch just inside the back door and tried to stand him on it, but Errol flopped straight off again, so Ron laid him on the draining board instead, muttering pathetic. Then he ripped open Hermione's letter and read it out loud. Dear Ron and Harry, if you're there. I hope everything went all right and that Harry is okay, and that you didn't do anything illegal to get him out. Ron, because that would get Harry into trouble too. I've been really worried, and if Harry is all right, will you please let me know at once? But perhaps it would be better if you used a different hour, because I think another delivery might finish your one off. I'm very busy with schoolwork, of course. How can she be? Said Ron in horror. We're on holiday, and we're going to London next Wednesday to buy my new books. Why don't we meet in Diagon Alley? Let me know what's happening as soon as you can. Love from Hermione. Well, that fits in nicely. We can go and get all your things then too, said Miss Weasley, starting to clear the table. What are you all up to today? Harry, Ron, Fred and George were planning to go up the hill to a small padlock the Weasleys owned. It was surrounded by trees that blocked it from view of the village below, meaning that they could practice Quidditch there as long as they didn't fly too high. They couldn't use real Quidditch balls, which would have been hard to explain if they had escaped and flown away over the village. Instead, they threw apples for each other to catch. They took it in turns to ride Harry's Nimbus 2000, which was easily the best broom. Ron's old shooting star was often outstripped by passing butterflies. 5 minutes later, they were marching up the hill, broomsticks over their shoulders. They had asked Percy if he wanted to join them, but he had said that he was busy. Harry had only seen Percy at mealtime so far. He stayed shut in his room the rest of the time. Wish I knew what he was up to, said Fred, frowning. He's not himself. His exam results came the day before you did, 12 OLLS, and he hardly gulped it at all. Ordinary wizarding levels, George explained, seeing Harry's puzzled look. Bill got 12 too. If we're not careful, we'll have another head boy in the family. I don't think I could stand the shame. Bill was the oldest Weasley brother. He and the next brother, Charlie, had already left Hogwarts. Harry had never met either of them, but knew that Charlie was in Romania, studying dragons, and Bill in Egypt, working for the wizard Spank Gringotts. Don't know how Mum and Dad are going to afford all our school stuff this year, said George after a while. 5 sets of Lockhart books, and Ginny needs robes and a wand and everything. Harry said nothing. He felt a bit awkward. Stored in an underground vault at Gringotts in London was a small fortune that his parents had left him. Of course, it was only in the wizarding world that he had money. You couldn't use galleons, sickles, and nuts in muggle shops. He had never mentioned Gringotts' bank account to the Dursleys. He didn't think the horror of anything consented with magic would stretch to a large pile of gold. Miss Weasley woke them all early for the following Wednesday. After a quick 6 bacon sandwiches each, they pulled on their coats and Miss Weasley took a flower pot off the kitchen mantelpiece and peered inside. We're running low, Arthur, she said. We'll have to buy some more today. Ah, well, guests first, after you, Harry dear. And she offered him the flower pot. Harry stared at them all, watching him. What am I supposed to do? He stammered. He's never travelled by Floo powder, said Ron suddenly. Sorry, Harry, I forgot. Never, said Mr. Weasley. But how did you get to Diagon Alley to buy your school things last year? I went on the underground. Really? Said Mr. Weasley eagerly. Were there escalators? How exactly? Not now, Arthur, said Miss Weasley. Floo powder's a lot quicker, dear. But goodness me, if you've never used it before. He'll be all right, Mum, said Fred. Harry, watch us first. He took a pinch of glittering powder out of the flower pot, stepped up to the fire and threw in the powder into the flames. The roar of fire turned emerald green and rose higher than Fred, who stepped right into it, shouted, Diagon Alley, and vanished. You must speak clearly, dear, Miss Weasley told Harry, as George dipped in his hand into the flower pot. And mind you, get out at the right gate. The right what? Said Harry nervously as the fire roared and whipped George out of sight too. Well, there are an awful lot of wizard fires to choose from, you know, but as long as you've spoken clearly, he'll be fine. Molly, don't fuss, said Mr. Weasley, helping himself to Floo powder too. But dear, if he got lost, how would we ever explain to his aunt and uncle? They wouldn't mind, Harry assured her. Dudley wouldn't think it was a brilliant joke if I got lost up a chimney. Don't worry about it. Well, all right. You go after Arthur, said Miss Weasley. Now when you get into the fire, say where you're going, and keep your elbows tucked in, Ron advised, and your eyes shut, said Miss Weasley. The suit don't fit you, said Ron, or you might, well, fall out of the wrong fireplace. But don't panic and get out too early. Wait until you see Fred and George. Trying hard to bear all this in mind, Harry took a pinch of Floo powder and walked to the edge of the fire. He took a deep breath, scattered the powder into the flames, and stepped forward. The fire fell like a warm breeze. He opened his mouth and immediately swallowed a lot of hot ash. Dying on alley, he coughed. It felt as though he was being sucked down a giant plug hole. He seemed to be spinning very fast. The roaring in his ears was deafening. He tried to keep his eyes open, but the whirl of green flames made him feel sick. Something hard knocked his elbow, and he tucked it in tightly, still spinning and spinning. Now it felt as though cold hands were slapping his face. Squinting through his glasses, he saw a blurred stream of fireplaces, and snatched glimpses of the rooms beyond. His bacon sandwiches were crunching inside him. He closed his eyes again, wishing it would stop. And then he fell face forward onto cold stone and felt his glasses shatter. Dizzy and bruised, covered in soot, he got gingerly to his feet, holding his broken glasses up to his eyes. He was quite alone, but where he was, he had no idea. All he could tell was that he was standing in the stone fireplace of what looked like a large, dimly lit wizard's shop, but nothing in here was ever likely to be on a Hogwarts school list. A glass case nearby had a withered hand on a cushion. A blood-stained pack of cards and a staring glass eye. Evil-looking masks leered down from the walls. An astronaut of human bones lay upon the counter, and rusty spiked instruments hung from the ceiling. Even worse, the dark, narrow street Harry couldn't see through the dusty shop window was definitely not dying on alley. The sooner he got out of here, the better. Nose still stinging where it had hit the hearth. Harry made his way swiftly and silently towards the door, but before he'd got halfway towards it, two people appeared on the other side of the glass, and one of them was the very last person Harry wanted to meet when he was lost. Covered in soot and wearing broken glasses, Draco Malfoy. Harry looked quickly around and spotted a large black cabinet to his left. He shot inside and pulled the doors to, leaving a small crack to peer through. Seconds later, a bell clanged and Malfoy stepped into the shop. The man he followed could only be his father. He had the same pale, pointed face and identical cold grey eyes. Mr. Malfoy crossed the shop, looking lazily at the items on display, and rang a bell on the counter before turning to his son and saying, "Touch nothing, Draco." Malfoy, who had reached for the glass eye, said, "I thought you were going to buy me a present." I said I would. "Buy you a racing broom," said his father, drumming his fingers on the counter. "What's the good of that if I'm not in the house team?" said Malfoy, looking sulky and bad-tempered. "Harry Potter got a Nimbus 2000 last year, special permission from Dumbledore so he could play for Gryffindor. He's not even that good. It's just because he's famous for having a stupid scar on his forehead." Malfoy bent down to examine a shelf full of skulls. "Everyone thinks he's so smart, a wonderful Potter with his scar and his broomstick." "You have told me this at least a dozen times already," said Mr. Malfoy, with a quilling look at his son, "and I would remind you that it is not prudent to appear less than fond of Harry Potter. Law and most of our kind regard him as a hero who made the Dark Lord disappear. Ah, Mr. Borgin, a stooping man had appeared behind the counter, smoothing his greasy hair back from his face. Mr. Malfoy, what a pleasure to see you again, said Mr. Borgin in a voice as oily as his hair. Delighted, and young Master Malfoy too, chummed. How may I be of assistance? I must show you. Just in today, and very reasonably priced. I'm not buying today, Mr. Borgin, but selling, said Mr. Malfoy. Selling. The smile faded slightly from Mr. Borgin's face. You have heard, of course, that the Ministry of is conducting more raids, said Mr. Malfoy, taking a roll of parchment from his inside pocket and unravelling it for Mr. Borgin to read. I have a few items at home that might embarrass me if the Ministry were to call. Mr. Borgin fixed a pince-nez to his nose and looked down the list. The Ministry wouldn't presume to trouble you, sir, surrogally. Mr. Malfoy's lips curled. I have not been visited yet. The name Malfoy still commands a certain respect. Yet the Ministry grows ever more meddlesome. There are rumours about a new Muggle Protection Act. No doubt the flea-bitten Muggle-loving for Arthur Weasley is behind it. Harry felt a lot surge of anger. And as you see, certain of these poisons might make it appear. I understand, sir, of course, said Mr. Borgin. Let me see, can I have that? Interrupted Draco, pointing at the withered hand on its cushion. Ah, the hand of glory, said Mr. Borgin, abandoning Mr. Malfoy's list and scurrying over to Draco. Insert a candle and it gives light only to the holder. Best friend of thieves and plunderers, your son is fine taste, sir. I hope my son will amount to more than a thief or a plunder, Borgin, said Mr. Malfoy, coldly, and Mr. Borgin said, quickly, no offence, sir, no offence meant. Though if his school marks don't pick up, said Mr. Malfoy, Mr. coldly still, the may indeed be all he is fit for. It's not my fault, retorted Draco. The teachers all have favourites, but Hermione Granger. I would have thought you'd been ashamed for the girl of no wizard family, be you in every exam, snapped Mr. Malfoy. Ha, said Harry under his breath, pleased to see Draco looking both abashed and angry. It's the same all over, said Mr. Borgin in his oily voice. Wizard blood is counting for less everywhere. Not with me, said Mr. Malfoy, his long nostrils flaring. No, sir, nor with me, sir, said Mr. Borgin with a deep bow. In that case, perhaps we could return to my list, said Mr. Malfoy shortly. I am in something of a hurry, Borgin. I have important business elsewhere today. They started to haggle. Harry watched nervously as Draco drew nearer and nearer to his hiding place, examining the objects for sale. He paused to examine a long coil of hangman's rope and to read, smirking the card popped on a magnificent necklace of opals. Caution, do not touch. Cursed. Has claimed for the lives of 19 Muggle Ortons to date. Draco turned away and saw the cabinet right in front of him. He walked forward. He stretched out his hand for the handle. Done, said Mr. Malfoy at the counter. Come, Draco. Harry whipped his forehead on his sleeve as Draco turned away. Good day to you, Mr. Borgin. I'll expect you at the mail tomorrow to pick up the goods. The moment the door had closed, Mr. Borgin dropped his oily manner. Good day yourself, Mr. Malfoy, and if the stories are true, you haven't sold me half of what's hidden in your manor. Muttering darkly, Mr. Borgin disappeared into a back room. Harry waited for a minute in case he came back, then quietly as he could, slipped out of the cabinet, past the cases, and out of the shop door. Clutching his broken glasses to his face, he stared around. He had emerged into a dingy alleyway that seemed to be made up entirely of shops devoted to the dark arts. The one he just left, Borgin and Burke's, looked like the largest, but opposite was a nasty window display of shrunken heads, and 2 doors down a large cage with gigantic black spiders, Two shabby-looking wizards were watching him from the shadow of a doorway, muttering to each other. Feeling jumpy, Harry set off, trying to hold his glasses on straight and hoping against hope he'd be able to find a way out of there. An old wooden street sign hanging over a shop selling poisonous candles told him he was in Contron Alley. This didn't help, as Harry had never heard of such a place. He supposed he hadn't spoken clearly enough through his mouthful of ashes back in the Weasley's fire. Trying to stay calm, he wondered what to do. "Not lost, are you, my dear?" said a voice in his ear, making him jump. An aged witch stood in front of him, holding a tray of what looked horribly like whole human fingernails. She leered at him, showing mossy teeth. Harry backed away. "I'm fine, thanks," he said. "I'm just—" "Harry! What d'you think you're doing down there?" Harry's heart leaped. So did the witch a load of fingernails cascaded down over her feet, and she cursed as the massive form of Hagrid, the Hogwarts gamekeeper, came striding towards them, beetle black eyes flashing over his great bristling beard. "Hagrid!" Harry croaked in relief. "I was lost. Flue powder." Hagrid seized Harry to the scuff of the neck and pulled him away from the witch, knocking the tray right out of her hands. Her shrieks followed them all the way along the twisting alleyway, out into bright sunlight. Harry saw a familiar snow-white marble building in the distance. Gringotts Bank. Harry had steered him right into Diagon Alley. "You're a mess," said Hagrid, gruffly brushing soot off Harry so forcefully he nearly knocked him into a barrel of dragon dung outside an apotheosis skulking around Nocturne Alley. "I don't know, dodgy place, Harry. Don't want no one to see you down there." "I realise that," said Harry, ducking as Hagrid made to brush him off again. "I told you I was lost. What were you doing down there anyway?" "I was looking for a flesh-eating slug repellent," growled Hagrid. "They're ruining the school cabbages. You're not on your own." "I'm staying with the Weasleys, but we got separated," Harry explained. "I've got to go and find them. They set off together down the street." "How come you never wrote back to me?" said Hagrid as Harry jogged alongside him. He had to take 3 steps to every stride of Hagrid's enormous boots. Harry explained all about Dobby and the Dursleys. "Ruddy muggles," growled Hagrid. "If I'd known—" "Harry! Harry! Over here!" Harry looked up and saw Hermione Granger standing at the top of the white flight of steps to Gringotts. She ran down to meet them, her blushy brown hair flying behind her. "What happened to your glasses?" "Hello, Hagrid. Oh, it's wonderful to see you two again. Are you coming into Gringotts, Harry?" "As soon as I've found the Weasleys," said Harry. "Yeah, won't have long to wait," groaned Hagrid. Harry and Hermione looked around, sprinting up the Coward Street were Ron, Fred, George, Percy, and Mr. Weasley. "Harry!" Mr. Weasley panted. "We hoped you'd only gone one grade too far." He mopped his glistening bald patch. "Molly's fantastic. She's coming now." "Where did you come out?" Ron asked. "Nocturne Alley," said Hagrid grimly. "Brilliant," said Fred and Josh together. "We've never been allowed in," said Ron embarrassedly. "I should Ruddy will think not," growled Hagrid. Miss Weasley now came galloping into view, her handbag swinging widely in one hand, Ginny just clinging on to the other. "Oh, Harry, oh, my dear, you could have been anywhere." Gasping for breath, she pulled a large clothes brush out of her bag and began sweeping off the soot Hagrid didn't manage to beat away. Mr. Weasley took Harry's glasses, gave them a tap of his wand, and returned them. "Good as new." "Well, gotta be off," said Hagrid. He was having his hand wrung by Miss Weasley. "Nocturne Alley, if you haven't found him, Hagrid. See you at Hogwarts." And he strode away, head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the packed street. "Guess who I saw in Borgin and Burke's?" Harry asked Ron and Hermione as they climbed the Gringotts steps. "Malfoy and his father." "Did Lucius Malfoy buy anything?" said Mr. Weasley sharply behind them. "No, he was selling." "So he's worried," said Mr. Weasley. with grim satisfaction. "Oh, I'd love to get Lucius Malfoy for something." "You be careful, Arthur," said Miss Weasley sharply as they were urged into the bank by a bowing goblin at the door. "That family's trouble. Don't go biting off more than you can chew." "So you don't think I'm a match for Lucius Malfoy?" said Mr. Weasley ingenuously, but he was distracted almost at once by the sight of Hermione's parents, who were standing nervously at the counter that ran all along the great marble hall, waiting for Hermione to introduce them. "But you're muggles," said Mr. Weasley ecstatically. "We must have a drink. What's that you've got there? Oh, you're changing muggle money. Molly, look!" He pointed excitedly at the £10 notes in Mr. Granger's hand. "Meet you back here," said Hermione. As the Weasleys and Harry were led off to the underground vaults by another Gringotts goblin, the vaults were reached by means of small goblin-driven carts that sped along miniature train tracks through the bank's underground tunnels. Harry enjoyed the breakneck journey down to the Weasleys' vault, but felt dreadful, far worse than he had in Knockturn Alley. When it was opened, there was a very small pile of silver sickles inside, and just one gold galleon. Miss Weasley fell right into the corners before sweeping the whole lot into a bag. Harry felt even worse when they reached his vault. He tried to block the contents from view as he hastily shoved handfuls of coins into his leather bag. Back outside on the marble steps, they all separated. Percy muttered vaguely about needing a new quill. Fred and George had stopped their friend from Hogwarts, Lee Jordan. Miss Weasley and Ginny were going to a second-hand robe shop. Mr. Weasley was insisting on taking the Grangers off to the Leaky Cauldron for a drink. "We'll all meet at Flourish and Blotts in an hour to buy your school books," said Miss Weasley, setting off with Ginny, "and not one step down Knockturn Alley," she shouted at the twins, retreating backs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione strolled off along the winding cobbled street. The bag of gold, silver, and bronze jangling cheerfully in Harry's pocket was glamouring to be spent, so he brought 3 large strawberry and peanut butter ice creams, which they slurped happily as they wandered up the alley. Examining the fascinating shop windows, Ron gazed longingly at the full set of childy cannon robes in the windows of quality Quidditch supplies, until Hermione dragged them off to buy ink and parchment next door in Gamble and Jape's Wizarding Joke shop. They met Fred, George, and Lee Jordan, who were stocking up on Dr. Hilbert's fabulous wet start. No heart fireworks, and in a tiny junk shop full of broken wands, wonky brass scales, and old cloaks covered in potion stains, they found Percy deeply immersed in a small and deeply boring book called Prefects Who Gained Power, a study of Hogwarts prefects and their later careers. Ron read aloud off the back cover. "That sounds fascinating." "Go away," Percy snapped. "Course he's very ambitious, Percy. He's got it all planned out. He wants to be Minister of Magic," Ron told Harry and Hermione in an undertone, as they left Percy to it. An hour later they headed for Flourish and Blotts. They were by no means the only ones making their way to the bookshop. As they approached it, they saw, to their surprise, a large crowd jostling outside the doors, trying to get in. The reason for this proclaimed by a large banner stretched across the upper windows. Glindery Lockhart will be signing copies of his autobiography Magical Me today, 12:30 to 4:30 p.m. "We can actually meet him," Hermione squealed. "I mean, he's written almost the whole book list." The crowd seemed to be made up mostly of witches around Miss Weasley's age. A harsh-looking wizard stood at the door, saying calmly, "Please, ladies, don't push. There, mind the books now." Harry, Ron, and Hermione squeezed inside. A long queue wound round to the back of the shop, where Glindery Lockhart was signing his books. They each grabbed a copy of Break with a Bansby and sneaked up the line to where the rest of the Weasleys were standing. with Mr. and Mrs. Granger. "Oh, there you are. Good," said Miss Weasley. She sounded breathless and kept patting her hair. "We'll be able to see him in a minute." Glittery Lockhart came slowly into view, seated at a table surrounded by large pictures of his own face, all winking and flashing dazedly with teeth at the crowd. The real Lockhart was wearing robes of forgot-me-not blue, which exactly matched his eyes. His pointed wizard's hat was set at a jaunty angle on his wavy hair. A short, interruptible-looking man was dancing around taking photographs with a large black camera that emitted puffs of purple smoke with every blinding flash. "Out of the way there," he snarled at Ron, moving back to get a better shot. "This was for the Daily Prophet." "Big deal," said Ron, rubbing his foot where the photographer had stepped on it. Glittery Lockhart heard him. He looked up. He saw Ron, and then he saw Harry. He stared. Then he leapt to his feet and positively shouted, "It can't be! Harry Potter!" The crowd parted, whispering excitedly. Lockhart dived forward, seized Harry's arm, and pulled him to the front. The crowd burst into applause. Harry's face burned as Lockhart shook his hand with the photographer, who was clicking away, madly whiffing thick smoke over the Weasleys. "Nice! Big smile," Harry said Lockhart through his own gleaming teeth. "Together, you and I are worth the front page." When he finally let go of Harry's hand, Harry could hardly feel his fingers. He tried to sidle back over to the Weasleys, but Lockhart threw an arm round his shoulders and clamped him tightly to his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving for quiet, "what an extraordinary moment this is! The perfect moment for me to make a little announcement I've been sitting on for some time." When young Harry stepped into Flourish and Blotts today, he only wanted to buy my autobiography, which I shall be happy to present him now, free of charge. The crowd applauded again. He had no idea. Lockhart continued, giving Harry a little shake that made his glasses slip to the end of his nose, that he would surely be getting much, much more than my book. Magical Me! He and his schoolfellows will in fact be getting the real Magical Me. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have great pleasure and pride in announcing that this September I'll be taking up the post of defense against the dark arts teacher at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The crowd cheered and clapped, and Harry found himself being presented with the entire worst of Glittery Lockhart. Strategy slowly under their weight, he managed to make his way out of the limelight to the edge of the room, where Ginny was standing next to a new cauldron. "You have these," Harry mumbled to her, tipping the books into the cauldron. "I'll buy my own." "Bet you loved that, didn't you, Potter?" said a voice Harry had no trouble recognizing. He straightened up and found himself face to face with Draco Malfoy, who was roaring his unusual sneer. "Famous Harry Potter," said Malfoy. "Can't even get into a bookshop without making the front page." "Leave him alone. He didn't want all that," said Ginny. It was the first time she had spoken in front of Harry. She was glaring at Malfoy. "Potter, you've got yourself a girlfriend," drawled Malfoy. Ginny went scarlet as Ron and Hermione fought their way over, both clutching stacks of Lockhart's books. "Oh, it's you," said Ron, looking at Malfoy as if he were something unpleasant of the sole of his shoe. "Bet you're surprised to see Harry here, hey?" "Not as surprised as I am to see you in a shop, Weasley," retorted Malfoy. "I suppose your parents would go hungry for one to pay for that lot." Ron went as red as Ginny. He dropped his books into the cauldron too, and started towards Malfoy, but Harry and Hermione grabbed the back of his jacket. "Ron," said Mr. Weasley, struggling over with Fred and George, "what are you doing?" "It's mad in here. Let's go outside." "Well, well, well, Arthur Weasley." It was Mr. Malfoy. He stood with his hand on Draco's shoulder, staring at in just the same way. "Lucius," said Mr. Weasley, nodding coldly. "Busy time at the ministry, I hear," said Mr. Malfoy. "All those raids. I hope they're paying you overtime." He reached into Jenny's cauldron and extracted from it amidst the glossary Lockhart books a very old, very battered copy of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration. "Obviously not," he said. "Dear me, what's the use of being a disgrace to the name of wizard if they don't even pay you well for it?" Mr. Weasley flushed darker than either Ron or Ginny. "We have a very different idea of what disgraces the name of wizard, Malfoy," he said. "Clearly," said Mr. Malfoy, his pale eyes strained to Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who were watching him precariously. "The company you keep, Weasley, and I thought your family could sink no lower." There was a thud of metal as Ginny's cauldron went flying. Mr. Weasley had thrown himself at Mr. Malfoy, knocking him backwards into a bookshelf. Dozens of Harry's spellbooks came thundering down on all their heads. There was a yell of "Get him, Dad!" from Fred or George. Miss Weasley was shrieking, "No, Arthur, no!" The crowd stampled backwards, knocking more shelves over. "Gentlemen, please, please," cried the assistant, and then louder than all, "break it up there, gents, break it up." Hagrid was waddling towards them through the sea of books. In an instant he had pulled Mr. Weasley and Mr. Malfoy apart. Mr. Weasley had a cut lip, and Mr. Malfoy had been hit in the eye by an enclosure of toadstools. He was still holding Ginny's old Transfiguration book. He thrust it at her, his eyes glittering with manacle. "Here, girl, take your book. It's the best your father can give you." Pulling himself out of Hagrid's grip, he beckoned to Draco and swept from the shop. "Yes, should have ignored him, Arthur," said Hagrid, almost lifting Mr. Weasley off his feet as he straightened his robes. "Rotten to the core. The whole family. Everyone knows that. No, Malfoy's worth listening to. Bad blood, that's what it is. Come on now, let's get out of here." The assistant looked as though he wanted to stop them leaving, but he barely came up to Hagrid's waist and seemed to think better of it. They hurried up the street, the Grangers shaking with fright, and Miss Weasley beside herself with "Very a fine example to set to your children, brawling in public with Grindelwald Lockhart." "Must have thought." "He was pleased," said Fred. "Didn't you hear him as we were leaving? He was asking that bloke from the Daily Prophet if he'd be able to work that into his report. Said it was all publicly." But it was a subdued group who headed back to the fireside in the leaky cauldron, where Harry, the Weasleys, and all their shopping would be travelling back to the Burrow using flea powder. They said goodbye to the Grangers, who were leaving the pub for Muggle Street on the other side. Mr. Weasley started to ask them how bus stops worked, but stopped quickly at the look on Miss Weasley's face. Harry took off his glasses and put them safely in his pocket before helping himself to flea powder. It definitely wasn't his favourite way to travel. And that's it of chapter 4. I hope you enjoyed, and if you did, don't forget to give this video a like. And while you're down there, subscribe, and you can unsubscribe at any time when you want. Take care, everyone. I'll see you in the next time. Bye.